Welcome everyone to MailFuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about The X-Files Season 2 Episode 15. It's called Fresh Bones. So spoilers for the episode as always. It's been a couple of weeks since the last episode. Schedule got a bit chaotic and this is even going out at a weird time of the week because I wanted to do this next just because it had been the longest since an episode of The X-Files. So unfortunately I'm returning with an episode that I didn't like very much and I kind of realized I probably wouldn't like it fairly early on, and it never really did much to win me over. I thought it was a chore to sit through this one. Part of that, I think, is mainly just my taste in stories, and typically when there's a plot about voodoo and possibly someone using that kind of witchcraft, if you want to call it that, to get revenge or something, I tend not to be super into. And it's really interesting actually to get this one right after that witch episode last time, because you can draw some parallels between them, and I think the execution of both is very different. Last episode played up the idea of the horror of like it could be anyone among us, and that whoever's doing this might be unstoppable because they seem to have powers via their witchcraft. This episode was a lot less intriguing as it went along. There was a lot less. I don't know. Every time something supposedly spooky happened because maybe there's a voodoo going on, pardon me. Every single time, I just didn't find it all that exciting. I didn't find it all that interesting, especially when it became, you know, kind of like wrapped up in a convoluted mystery of like this colonel who's running this refugee camp and he's doing these atrocious things. I guess, you know, we're in spoilers, but the one interesting thing about it ultimately is realizing that the person using the voodoo and the dark magics is actually the colonel, because he actually stole it from Haiti because it's a Haitian refugee camp. So there's a lot of fingers being pointed and sort of audience being led to believe that there's maybe this character who's Haitian who's doing all this stuff, but it's actually the American colonel who seemed to get into all this when he was stationed, you know, across seas at some point. So he's the one doing rituals. He's the one who's taking out revenge on people, and that's at least a little interesting, just from a just from the thematic idea of that this is something else that, like, an American is colonized and appropriated for himself. So the idea that he's the cruel colonel who's ordering his men to beat up like refugees and things like that. It all ends up being tied to this idea of revenge because he lost some men when he was in Haiti. His men committed suicide, and this seems to be him getting revenge. Obviously, the main victims during the episode are soldiers who are stationed at this base. That's the entire cold open of the episode is this married soldier who's having a temper. He's having these visions. He's not having a great time communicating with his wife. And then he seemingly dies when he's in a car accident. But there's like a weird, you know, ritualistic symbol on the tree that he crashes into. And just some other things to suggest that there's something else going on, which leads to the wife contacting the FBI and Mulder and Scully getting involved. And the reason why it's these soldiers who are being targeted is because they were actually going to expose and testify against their colonel for all of his inhumane practices and the way he's treating people. Not just like the refugees, but even his own men. Like, he has this kind of iron, like, hand kind of thing going on. So yeah, like all of that is relatively fine. It just falls into a lot of tropey things for me that I don't particularly like. I don't think the Colonel's that interesting a character. He's kind of just obviously a bad guy the second we see him, even though he tries to pretend that he's very compliant and wants to help Mulder and Scully in their investigation. He's just not that interesting a character. I don't think we ever really get to know any of the characters the story's actually about. There's so many different people to go see with Mulder and Scully that I never felt like we got to really know and care about the soldier who seemed to have died but then came back later and it might technically be a zombie, kinda. I don't think we ever got close and connected to him. I think one thing that might have went a long way with that is maybe seeing him feel regret for how he's been treating his wife and son, because honestly the opening of the episode makes it quite easy to dislike him, even though there's context as to why he's acting this way. we never get him interacting with his wife again. So we never see that if he's better once he comes back from the dead, quote unquote. So it's hard to kind of sympathize. The other soldier who dies, maybe we can sympathize with him a little bit more, but we don't spend that much time with him. One of the things that the episode tries to do to pull at your heartstrings is there's a kid in the refugee camp who tries to sell Scully like a charm for protection. And this was kind of the moment actually where I knew I was probably not going to like the episode, is when this kid runs up and says, hey, this is a charm to protect against like bad spirits and stuff. And I was like, it's one of these. It's one of these types of episodes. Sadly, I never really quite was able to go above that for me. But this kid is someone who they catch later on robbing or collecting frogs at the cemetery, which they're investigating because they suspect someone who died previously had their bones dug up, which they did. They end up spending some time with this kid. They take him to a diner, they feed him. He doesn't have parents, he's whatever. And this is the character who I suspect we're supposed to sympathize with the most because he is just a kid. But they pull a little twist with this kid, right? Where when he runs away, he seemingly disappears into nothing, and then there's a cat, and the implication might be that he turned into the cat. And then we kind of get like another moment like that later on where the cat kind of shows up, and it reminds Scully to like grab the little charm that he gave her, which ends up saving her because she's having visions at that moment. Which was, to be fair, the vision she has, because she gets a scratch and it leads to her having these like little moments of visions. The visual of like this man coming out of her hand, because like her cut opens up and you see like a hand burst through, like obviously a prosthetic of some kind. And then in the next shot, there's just a fully grown man, like in the car seat with her. I was like, damn, that's actually a really weird visual. It's probably the most interesting that any of it ever got, as far as just feeling between... Actually, just to finish what I was saying about the kid before I move on to that point. So the kid turns out was dead the whole time, because when they're moving all the refugees at the end of the episode, they say, oh, like, well, there's one missing. Isn't there a kid here who's named Chester? And the guy's like, yeah, he was here, but he died like weeks ago. Because they referenced early on that a few weeks ago there'd been a riot and like a child had died in it. So the twist at the end of the episode is that the kid that they'd been talking to was that child, and that seemingly his spirit or something was hanging around to help Mulder and Scully and maybe find some justice for what's going on here. Sure. I honestly, I didn't really feel much for that. I kind of felt like, oh yeah, okay, sure. It felt like a really, I don't know, like a sort of sentimental twist kind of thing. It made me feel like, remember, like, this was a very good episode, but in the episode where Scully was in the coma, and it revealed at the end that the nurse was like not real the whole time, she'd never actually been there, and that she was something else. I think, like, I felt similar to this reveal like I did to that, where it just feels a little bit sickly sweet, right? Where it's like, oh, the dead child was helping us. I don't know, I didn't like it very much. But what I was getting to, though, is that it's really fascinating to me having this episode and the last episode back to back, because they really highlight where my tastes lie when it comes to someone using magic for heinous purposes. And I think when you treat it more like a horror story, like the last episode did, I can get into it more. And I think when you treat it more like, no, there's someone, or it's more of a cultural thing as opposed to just a straight up like magic thing, or a demonic, or, you know, like a satanic thing. Like, I guess satanic as an idea of like dark magic is more interesting to me than saying that some other culture from another country, which always feels like we're dancing around being insensitive. And I'm not saying this episode necessarily was, but I always feel like there's a potential of that anytime one of these stories comes up. It's like, oh, foreign, weird things happen in foreign places. Like, it kind of has that vibe to me, and I wasn't really, you know, it's always a bit of a barrier for me to get into an episode like that. Like I said, it did kind of circumvent that a little bit by it turning out to be the Colonel who's just straight up the bad guy, and that the obvious person who could be the leader of like whatever cult is doing all this. This character, was his name, Bouvet, who's this guy they've imprisoned and they've blamed for starting the riot that happened previously. I think him not turning out to have anything to do with it, I like because of the sort of the more real world corruption aspect of the Colonel character. That said, though, every time we see this character movie, he still talks like mysteriously, like he knows stuff. He still gives vague warnings about supernatural things and about, oh, you'll get one warning and that'll be all you get and you'll have to back off. And he still has a lot of the tropes of the character who would end up being the one doing all the voodoo rituals. I like that it circumvents it, but it didn't really make all the scenes with that character any less like typical of this type of episode. So, you know, I think that part of this is just a taste thing. I don't think this is necessarily a really bad episode by any means, but for my taste, I thought this was a chore to get through, and I was just kind of like hoping for it to get moving at a certain point and just sort of be done with it so I can get to more interesting episodes that appeal to me. So, and it's always tough coming in to an episode like this where I don't feel particularly positive, and any like minor things that I do appreciate, and I've already kind of mentioned most of them, I think, is, you know, they're few and far between, and I'm looking for like little Mulder and Scully moments that I can kind of latch on to as, oh well, at least I like this little moment between them where one cares about the other, or they have a bit of banter, or like hell, we get Mr. X, the new Deep Throat, back in this episode. And honestly, I didn't really think this added that much to it, other than just kind of establishing the idea that the conspiracy goes further up, that Mulder says, wait, so this kind of revenge is almost sanctioned by the government, right? They're letting him get away with whatever he's doing. So, it ties it and says that the institution kind of allows for this and gives someone like this Colonel character more power. So I can appreciate that, but I don't think afterwards I really felt like this felt like such a standalone story. It didn't seem like it warranted Mr. X's like presence or involvement. So I don't know, maybe you could read into it as him caring about this a little bit more or something, and to maybe flesh out his character, but I really didn't get a whole lot from that. Yeah, like I said, elsewhere, Scully having her vision towards the end, because of the cut she got that kind of started off her as kind of the next potential victim. This felt so undercooked to me. This is one of the things that really felt lacking, because last episode it felt like, oh, if the witch set her sights on Mulder and Scully, they'd be in deep trouble. And at the end it was like, oh no, the witch was never targeting them because she didn't feel she needed to, but they could have been very dangerous if she did. Here it feels like they are targeted, right? Because the symbol's under the car at one point, Scully starts having these feelings and visions. But ultimately it never really feels much more than Scully just having like an illness for like a couple of scenes, and then has the vision, and then it's over. As soon as she touches the talisman that the kid gave her, that's it. And because I'm not that excited about the idea of a ghost or a spirit giving her a thing to ward off evil, it's just not as interesting to me as even other takes on supernatural stuff like last episode, where I think the horror aspect of it was so much more effective and creepy. Here, I just wasn't feeling that quite so much. I think some of these characters really could have been fleshed out. If I could have cared more for one of the victims, I think that would have went a long way. I think if I could have gotten to know the villain, the Colonel, better, or maybe he was just a bit more nuanced, perhaps, then that might have went a long way. As it is, I feel like these elements are all a little undercooked because there's so much to stuff into the episode. So I didn't really find myself feeling all that excited by it by the end. And there's some big moments where, like, the soldier who is kind of confessing to Mulder and Scully that there's a lot of bad stuff going on, and he wants to out the Colonel as a bastard. He turns up dead in Mulder's bathtub, and it's pretty, it's a fairly gruesome moment, but I found it a little underwhelming overall. It didn't feel like a big enough deal in the episode compared to what it felt like it should have felt like. It felt like this should be like a big turning point in the story. Someone's just turned up dead in their bathtub. They should be a lot more concerned. They should be a lot more worried that someone was able to sneak into their motel room and do this. It feels like it should be really ramping up at this point. But immediately, the culprit just turns out to be the soldier from the start of the episode, who is admitting that he probably killed him because he can't explain it anything else, but he doesn't actually remember doing it. You know, he just shows up with like a blade in his hand immediately. So the question of what happened is answered right away, and that's it. And I guess we can extrapolate that the colonel's making it look like this soldier's killed the other one, and that takes them both out of the picture, so that neither one of them can out him as an evil person, right? Which is fine. Like I get it. I get the logic of everything it presents me for the most part. I don't find a lot of it all that compelling. Instead of being creepy, it felt like it just had to explain too many people, too many things going on, and too many characters that combine that with the fact that I just, from a taste perspective, just don't tend to enjoy these types of stories as much. I just wasn't really quite feeling it. Honestly, the most interesting thing about the episode is just seeing an episode from the early 90s talk about refugees and talk about how, you know, how much rights they have as people, and hearing the colonel complain that the refugees have more rights and they're spending more time talking about them than about talking about his men and taking care of them, and they should be taken care of because they're Americans and so on. Like, hearing that type of debate in this time period, sort of before, like, I mean, I was alive, but, you know, before I was old enough to really pay attention to any of that, hearing that type of debate in this time period was at least a little bit interesting, just because, like, obviously it's a topic, you know, immigration and refugees is a topic that comes up a lot, just in the world in general, but certainly comes up a lot with the US. So it was interesting from like a real world history perspective, just to see them tackle this subject. I just don't think the finished episode is all that exciting. Also, there's like the guy that works at the cemetery. When Mulder and Scully go at the cemetery, and he like sort of explains that there's grave diggers like occasionally. He just like whips out a pistol and says, "Hey, this is why I keep this on me now, because I need to run off the grave diggers." Which, whatever. Like, obviously, as a non-American, the idea of just having a gun on you is weird to me. But the thing that really caught me, though, is that when they hear the kid or see the kid in the distance at one of the graves, and we find out he's just getting frogs, but they see the kid in the distance, this guy at the cemetery clicks the gun, is like, "I'll take care of this." And Mulder and Scully are like, "No, we'll handle it. You just stay back here." Like, this guy was ready to pull out a revolver when he saw a 10, 11-year-old in the distance. I'm like, what? We going to go pop a cap in his ass? What? He's a kid. How much trouble do you think he's going to give you? It's one kid. It's not a pack of kids. It's not some big tough dude. It's a child. Calm down. Put your gun back in your pocket, you lunatic. Anyway, that's the thing. Do I have it? I feel like I've come in and just kind of rambled with this one because I don't really have any coherent. Like, you know, I love coming into a review with like a central thing that I really want to talk about, a central theme or a central character thing that the episode revolves around that I can really use as a framework to talk about everything else. This didn't really have that for me. And it's a shame because the photograph on IMDb almost makes it look like we're getting like a sort of Blair Witch style story. Not like a found footage, but just in terms of the plot. But of course, the last episode was more like that than this one was. I wouldn't say there's a lot of Mulder and Scully moments that I particularly liked either. So yeah, I'm a bit down in this one. But hey, maybe the next one will perk me up a little bit. Next episode is called Colony. Oh, I recognize the face in this photo. That's Brian Thompson, who's played multiple characters on the hit television show Buffy the Vampire Slayer, as well as Cobra, the Sylvester Stallone movie, and other things. Multiple Star Trek characters as well, I think. But yeah, here's the description on IMDb. When someone sends Mulder and Scully obituaries showing 3 separate but identical men apparently having died, the agents investigate, but they take an unexpected turn when Mulder receives a call from his father. Okay, so we're getting some personal stuff. That sounds like an interesting mystery, though. That 3 of the exact same person seems to have died. Are we dealing with some sort of shapeshifter, some kind of clone thing? I have no idea. We'll find out next time. But yeah, let me know what you think of this episode in the comments below. Like, subscribe, all that stuff helps out a bunch if you do. And of course, you can support all the content over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV or via YouTube memberships if that's more your thing. You get more stuff over at Patreon though, so I always push that a little bit more. But thank you for joining. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?